August 1st, 1944. In the map room at OB West headquarters, the morning situation report showed something that made no sense. American Third Army, officially activated just hours earlier, had already pushed 20 miles beyond where intelligence said they should be. The pins marking their forward elements kept moving east. Every update moved them farther. The staff officers updating the map exchanged glances. At this rate, they would run out of map. General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, 62 years old, commander of all German forces in the West, studied the reports with the practiced calm of 4 decades in uniform. He had commanded armies in Poland, in France in 1940, in Russia. He knew what a breakthrough looked like. This was something else. The Americans were not breaking through. They were simply driving forward as if the front no longer existed. The numbers arriving from the front defied belief. Third Army's 4th Armored Division had advanced 40 miles in a single day, not fighting through prepared defenses, not conducting a careful advance, simply racing forward, brushing aside whatever stood in their way. The 6th Armored Division, moving parallel to them, had covered similar ground. Behind them, infantry divisions were advancing faster than German units could retreat. Kluge ordered coffee and studied the larger map. The Normandy front, which had held for 8 weeks, had simply dissolved. Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive that began a week earlier, had torn open the German left flank. Now this Patton, the American general they had tracked since North Africa, was exploiting that gap with a speed that seemed impossible for a modern army. The telephone rang. 7th Army headquarters, calling to report that American armor had reached Avranches, 30 miles south of where the front had been yesterday. The town had fallen before anyone could organize a defense. Third Army was now pouring through. A gap barely 10 miles wide, but they were moving so fast that the gap itself was becoming irrelevant. By the time German forces could move to block one route, American columns had already taken 3 others. Kluge's chief of staff entered with fresh reports. Third Army was not just advancing, they were advancing in multiple directions simultaneously. Some columns were driving west into Brittany, toward the ports. Others were turning east, toward the Seine. Still others were pushing south. It was as if Patton had simply decided that the entire region belonged to him and was taking possession of it all at once. The staff began calculating. If Third Army maintained this pace, they would reach the Seine in 2 weeks. The Seine, 200 miles from where they had started. That would put them within striking distance of Paris. It would put them behind most of Army Group B. It would make the entire German position in France untenable. Kluge picked up the telephone to call Berlin. He needed to explain to the Führer what was happening. But how do you explain something you barely understand yourself? The American Third Army, as German intelligence understood it, consisted of 12 divisions, perhaps 300,000 men, with over 4,000 tanks and armored vehicles. These numbers came from months of careful intelligence work, from aerial reconnaissance, from captured documents, from radio intercepts. The numbers were solid. What was not solid was how those divisions were being used. A German panzer division, even at full strength, could advance perhaps 20 miles in a day under ideal conditions. That was with good roads, no opposition, perfect weather. In combat against resistance, 10 miles was good progress. 15 was exceptional. Third Army's lead elements were covering 50, 60 miles per day, while fighting, while capturing towns, while taking thousands of prisoners. The reports kept coming. Rennes, 50 miles into Brittany, had fallen on August 4th. American armor had simply driven into the city before the garrison could react. Vannes, on the Atlantic coast, fell the same day. Third Army had reached the sea in 4 days. Units that had been in Normandy on August 1st were now 100 miles away. Kluge studied the map of Brittany. The peninsula was supposed to be a fortress. 4 major ports, fortified and garrisoned. Brest, Saint-Malo, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire. Tens of thousands of troops, coastal defenses. The Americans were supposed to need months to reduce these positions. Instead, Patton had simply driven past most of them. He had sealed them off with minimal forces and kept moving. The garrisons, isolated and useless, could sit in their fortresses while the war moved on without them. But it was the eastern thrust that kept Klug awake. While one corps raced through Brittany, the rest of Third Army was driving toward the Seine. Le Mans fell on August 8th, 80 miles from the start line. Alençon fell on August 12th, 100 miles. Argentan on August 13th. The Americans were now within 20 miles of Falaise, where the bulk of German 7th Army was fighting desperately to avoid encirclement. The staff officers at OB West headquarters worked in shifts now, updating the maps every few hours. The pins marking American positions moved so fast that they started using pencil marks instead. By the time they could place a pin, the information was outdated. Klug's operations officer, a lieutenant colonel who had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, stood before the map and simply shook his head. "Sir, I've never seen anything like this. Not in Russia, not in France in '40. The Americans are advancing faster than we did in the best days of Barbarossa." The comparison was apt. In June 1941, German panzer divisions had torn through Soviet defenses with unprecedented speed, but that was against a surprised, poorly led enemy. Here, the Germans were not surprised. They knew the Americans were coming. They had prepared defenses. They had veteran troops, good equipment, and yet Patton's army was moving even faster than the Wehrmacht had at its peak. The telephone rang again. Hitler's headquarters, demanding an explanation, demanding a plan to stop the Americans, demanding a counterattack. Klug took the call in his private office. The Führer's voice was sharp, insistent. How had this happened? Why had the front collapsed? Why were American tanks racing across France unopposed? Klug explained as carefully as he could. The Americans had concentrated overwhelming force at a single point. They had achieved breakthrough. Now they were exploiting that breakthrough with unprecedented speed and aggression. The German forces in France simply did not have the strength to stop them. Hitler's response was predictable. Attack, counterattack, cut off the American spearhead, destroy Third Army before it could consolidate. There were still panzer divisions available. Use them. Strike west from Mortagne, cut through to Avranches, sever Patton's supply line. Without supplies, Third Army would wither. Klug tried to explain the reality. The panzer divisions were under strength, exhausted from weeks of combat. They would be attacking into the teeth of American air power. The Americans had complete air superiority. Any German movement in daylight brought immediate fighter-bomber attacks. The counterattack would need to succeed in days, or it would simply add to the disaster. Hitler was unmoved. The attack would proceed. Operation Lüttich. 4 panzer divisions attacking west from Mortagne toward Avranches. The objective was not just to cut Patton's supply line, but to trap Third Army against the Atlantic and destroy it. The order was final. Klug hung up and returned to the map room. His staff was waiting. They had heard the conversation. They knew what was coming. The operations officer began drafting orders for the counterattack. The intelligence officer pulled together what information they had about American positions around Mortagne. It was not encouraging. Third Army had already pushed so far east that the counterattack would be striking at their rear areas, not their spearhead. And those rear areas were now filling with fresh American divisions. The attack began on August 7th before dawn. 4 panzer divisions, perhaps 60,000 men, 200 tanks, drove west from Mortagne. For a few hours, it looked like it might work. The Americans, surprised by the sudden attack, gave ground. German armor pushed several miles into the American lines. Then the sun came up. and with it came the fighter bombers. American aircraft appeared in waves. P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with rockets and bombs. They fell on the German columns like hawks on mice. Every road, every crossroads, every village became a killing ground. German tanks that survived the first attacks pulled into woods, under trees, anywhere they could find cover. But the Americans had rockets that could penetrate any armor, and pilots who had been hunting German tanks for weeks. They knew what they were doing. By afternoon on the first day, the counterattack had stalled. By the second day, it was clear it had failed. By the third day, the panzer divisions were pulling back, having accomplished nothing except adding to their own casualties. The 4 divisions that had attacked with 200 tanks came back with fewer than 70, and while the counterattack failed at Mortain, Patton kept moving. Third Army had not even slowed down. If anything, the German focus on Mortain had opened up more opportunities. American columns pushed through gaps that had been left undefended because every available unit was being fed into the counterattack. By the time the attack collapsed, Third Army had advanced another 50 miles. Klug returned to his office on August 10th and drafted a report to Berlin. He chose his words carefully. The situation in France was no longer sustainable. The 7th Army was in danger of encirclement at Falaise. The counterattack had failed. Third Army was now beyond any possibility of containment. Army Group B needed to withdraw behind the Seine immediately, or risk total destruction. The response from Berlin was curt. No withdrawal. Hold the line. Renew the counterattack. The Führer was certain that the situation could be restored with proper leadership. Klug read the message and understood what it meant. He was being blamed. The failure at Mortain, the collapse of the front, the disaster unfolding across France. It was his fault, according to Berlin. Never mind that he had opposed the counterattack. Never mind that he had warned repeatedly about the weakness of German forces in the West. Never mind that he had been right about everything. He was the commander. He was responsible. On August 15th, Klug received another call from Berlin. He was being relieved. General Feldmarschall Walter Model would take over as commander of OB West and Army Group B. Klug was to return to Germany immediately. The message was clear. He was being recalled to face consequences. Klug spent his last day at headquarters preparing the handover. Model arrived on August 17th, 53 years old, energetic, known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to stabilize crumbling fronts. Model spent 2 hours reviewing the situation maps, reading the reports, asking questions. Then he called Klug into his office. "Tell me honestly," Model said. "Can this be stabilized?" Klug looked at the map. Third Army was now spread across a front 200 miles wide. They had reached the Seine at multiple points. Paris was directly threatened. The 7th Army pocket at Falaise was collapsing. Most of Army Group B was in danger of being cut off. The Americans were advancing faster than German units could retreat. "No," Klug said. "It cannot be stabilized. We need to withdraw everything behind the Seine immediately. Even then, I'm not certain we can save the army." Model nodded slowly. He had commanded armies in Russia. He had seen disasters before. But this was different. The Americans were not just defeating the German army. They were simply driving past it, as if it did not exist. Klug left headquarters on August 18th. He never reached Germany. On August 19th, somewhere on the road between France and the Reich, he took poison. He left a letter for Hitler. In it, he described the situation in France as hopeless. He praised the courage of the German soldiers. He accepted responsibility for the defeat, and he suggested, carefully, that perhaps it was time to consider ending the war. Hitler never replied to the letter. Model continued the fight in France for another month, conducting a fighting retreat that saved some of Army Group B but could not change the fundamental reality. By September, Third Army had advanced 400 miles from where they started. They had liberated most of France. They had reached the German border. In the map room at OB West headquarters, now relocated far to the east, the staff officers continued their work. They still updated the situation maps. They still tracked American positions. But the pins marking Third Army's location now sat on the Rhine, at the edge of Germany itself. The advance that had seemed impossible in August had simply continued week after week until there was nowhere left to retreat. Model, reviewing the maps in late August, called his intelligence officer in for a final assessment. "How many divisions does Third Army have now?" The intelligence officer consulted his notes. 12 divisions, sir, the same number they started with." "And how much ground have they covered?" "Approximately 400 miles, sir, in 4 weeks." Model did the mathematics in his head. 50 miles per week, 7 miles per day, every single day for a month, while fighting, while capturing prisoners, while liberating cities. The numbers were accurate. He had verified them himself. They were also impossible. And yet they had happened. "What did Patton do differently?" Model asked. "How did he move so fast?" The intelligence officer had been studying this question for weeks. "Sir, I believe it is not what he did differently. It is what he did not do. He did not stop. When his lead elements encountered resistance, he did not pause to reduce it. He went around it. When he captured a town, he did not stop to secure it. He left minimal forces and kept moving. When his supply lines stretched thin, he did not halt to consolidate. He pushed forward and trusted that supplies would catch up. He treated the advance not as a series of operations, but as a single, continuous movement. He never gave us time to react." Model nodded. It was a good analysis. Patton had understood something fundamental about modern warfare. Speed was not just an advantage. Speed was a weapon. If you moved fast enough, the enemy could not respond. Their decision cycle could not keep up. By the time they understood where you were already somewhere else. By the time they moved forces to block you had already gone around them. Speed created confusion, and confusion created opportunity, and opportunity created more speed. The Germans had invented this kind of warfare. They had called it Blitzkrieg. They had used it to conquer Poland in weeks, France in months. They had driven deep into Russia with it. But somewhere along the way, they had forgotten their own lessons. Their armies had become cautious, defensive, reactive. And now an American general had taken their own doctrine and used it against them with a perfection they had never achieved themselves. In Berlin, at the Reich Chancellery, Hitler received the reports from France with increasing fury. The maps in his own headquarters showed the same impossible advance. Not all armies' positions, marked in red, stretched from Normandy to the German border. The speed of the advance had been so great that the maps could barely keep up. Cartographers had to redraw them every few days just to show where the Americans were now. At a military conference in late August, Hitler demanded explanations from his staff. How had this happened? How had a single American army destroyed the entire German position in France? Where had the Wehrmacht's vaunted defensive capabilities gone? General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the OKW operations staff, provided the analysis. Mein Führer, the Americans achieved several things simultaneously. First, they concentrated overwhelming force at the breakthrough point. Second, they exploited that breakthrough with unprecedented speed. Third, they had complete air superiority, which prevented us from moving forces to counter them. Fourth, they had sufficient supplies and equipment to sustain the advance. And fifth, they were commanded by a general who understood that speed creates its own opportunities. Hitler interrupted. "Patton. Everything comes back to Patton. We knew he was dangerous. We knew he was in Normandy. Why did we not stop him?" Jodl chose his words carefully. "Mein Führer, we tried. The forces available in France were insufficient. The counterattack at Mortain failed because we no longer had the strength to conduct offensive operations against an enemy with complete air superiority. By the time we understood the scale of the threat, Third Army was already beyond our ability to contain. Hitler stood and walked to the map. He stared at the red line marking Third Army's advance. 400 miles in a month, from the Atlantic coast to the German border. An entire army group destroyed. France lost, and now the Americans were at the gates of Germany itself. "How many men did we lose in France?" Hitler asked. Jodl consulted his notes. "Approximately 400,000, mein Führer. Killed, wounded, or captured. Most of the 7th Army, significant portions of the 5th Panzer Army. Multiple divisions completely destroyed." Hitler turned from the map. "And how many did Patton lose?" "Approximately 20,000 casualties, mein Führer, a ratio of 20 to 1 in their favor." The room was silent. The numbers spoke for themselves. Third Army had not just defeated the German forces in France. They had destroyed them while barely slowing down. The speed of the advance had prevented the Germans from conducting any kind of organized defense. By the time German units could prepare positions, American armor was already past them. By the time German commanders could issue orders, the situation had changed. The Americans had fought a completely different kind of war, and the Germans had been unable to adapt. Hitler returned to his seat. "What is Patton doing now?" "His lead elements are at the Moselle River, mein Führer. They are preparing to cross into Germany. We estimate he will reach the Rhine within weeks, if not stopped." "And can he be stopped?" Jodl paused. "Not with the forces currently available in the West, mein Führer. We would need to transfer divisions from the Eastern Front. Even then, given Third Army's demonstrated capabilities, stopping them would require significant force and considerable luck." Hitler dismissed the staff. He sat alone in the map room, studying the charts that showed the collapse of Germany's position in the West. The red line marking Third Army's advance dominated the map. It was a line that represented not just military defeat, but a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. The Germans had thought they understood modern war. They had pioneered armored warfare, had perfected the combination of tanks and aircraft and rapid movement. And then an American general had taken those same tools and used them with a speed and aggression that made the German achievements look cautious by comparison. Back at Third Army headquarters, now located in eastern France, Patton stood before his own maps. His staff was planning the next phase of operations. The advance across France had been everything he had hoped for. His divisions had moved faster, fought harder, and achieved more than anyone had thought possible. They had liberated hundreds of towns, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, destroyed multiple German divisions, and they had done it in 2 weeks of continuous movement that had left the German high command reeling. But Patton understood what the Germans were only beginning to grasp. The speed was not just about covering ground. It was about psychology. Every day that Third Army advanced, German commanders had to make decisions based on outdated information. Every day that American tanks appeared in unexpected places, German soldiers had to wonder if they were already surrounded. Every day that the advance continued, the German belief in their own ability to stop it eroded a little more. The German High Command had watched Third Army cross France in 2 weeks, and what they had seen had shaken their understanding of what was possible in modern warfare. They had seen an army move with a speed that defied their calculations. They had seen their own defenses simply bypassed, their counterattacks absorbed without slowing the advance, their entire strategic position in France collapse in a month. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was faster, more aggressive, and more devastating than anything they had imagined. Model, in his headquarters east of the Rhine, read the final reports from France. The numbers were precise. Third Army had advanced 406 miles in 31 days. They had liberated over 600 towns and cities. They had captured over 65,000 prisoners. They had destroyed or captured over 500 tanks and thousands of other vehicles. They had done this while suffering fewer casualties than the Germans, inflicted in a single major battle on the Eastern Front. He called his intelligence officer one final time. One question: could we have stopped them? If we had done everything perfectly, made no mistakes, had perfect intelligence and perfect execution, could we have stopped Third Army? The intelligence officer had been thinking about this question for weeks. Sir, I believe the answer is no. The speed of their advance was the weapon itself. Even if we had known exactly where they were going, even if we had moved forces perfectly to intercept them, they would have simply gone somewhere else. They were moving faster than our decision cycle, faster than our ability to react. The only way to stop them would have been to not let them break through in the first place. Once they were loose in our rear areas, once Patton had room to maneuver, I do not believe any force we had available could have contained them. Model nodded. It was the answer he had expected. The Americans had not just won a battle. They had demonstrated a new level of operational art. They had shown that with sufficient speed, sufficient aggression, and sufficient resources, a modern army could simply overwhelm any defense. The Germans had thought they understood this. They had practiced it in Poland and France and Russia. But they had never achieved what Patton achieved in France in August 1944. They had never moved that fast, that far, with that much sustained momentum. The war would continue for another 9 months. But for the German High Command, something fundamental had changed in those 2 weeks in August. They had watched an American army cross France faster than they had thought possible. They had tried to stop it and failed. They had tried to understand it and found their assumptions inadequate. They had watched their entire position in France collapse in a month, and they had been unable to do anything but retreat. What the German High Command said in their reports and their conferences and their private conversations was that they had never seen anything like it. Not in Russia, not in their own campaigns, not in any war in history. An army had simply driven across a country, covering hundreds of miles in weeks, brushing aside everything in its path. And the speed itself had been the weapon that made it unstoppable.